session for the conference is variations on conference themes. And we put this panel together because we felt that although their focus of their presentations are quite different, they somehow illustrated well the themes of resiliency, the themes about climate change, of course, and water, and also themes of scale and hierarchy and adaptation and natural system interaction with human systems very well. And so we have Katie Lackey with the Water Environment Research Foundation, Derek Konekis at the Voinovich School at Ohio University, Tom Denbo from Biohabitats, Brian Stubbs from the Cleveland Water Alliance, and Sonda Kaufman from here at the Levin College. So if you guys want to run it just like we did before, come up and do your thing, and next person come up. These folks have been given 12 to 15 minutes, so if they stay within the 15 minutes, we'll have time for questions at the end, and I have a little card over here that I'll start waving at you if you're at 3 minutes, if it looks like you're going to go over. And we'll see how well they get used to this wonderful little mousy thing. All right, Katie, you want to come up?
You're all not academics. You're always going to try to time yourself. Yeah. Why just talk until they try you out? So much more polite. No, I get that.
Great. Well, thank you, Wendy, and it's really great to be here. Again, my name is Katie Lackey, and I'm with the Water Environment Research Foundation, or WERF. And today I'll be talking on a project that we did looking at extreme climate weather events and how water and wastewater utilities are adapting. So I'm going to give you a quick overview or background of our project, then talk a little bit about the risks that utilities are facing with these events, how they are managing risks currently, and how they are looking to better manage risks in the future. I'll give you a few examples of resilience that we saw in our case studies, but given the time constraint, I really encourage you to check out our full report. And then I'll briefly discuss where we go from here. So this project actually began with a very collaborative partnership back in 2009 between EPA, NOAA, WERF, WaterRF, and several other organizations. And this group funded an initial workshop in 2010, national workshop looking at research needs and decision support tools related to climate change in the water and wastewater sector. The major outcome of this project or this workshop was that there was a need for nationwide workshops giving real examples of what is working and what is not working in regards to utility adaptation. So WERF and its partners set out to conduct workshops in communities across the United States that had experienced an extreme event or several events to better understand how water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities and their communities were affected by these events, but also to learn how they were responding and how they're planning to respond for future events, especially given uncertainty. We also looked at identifying information needs and gaps to improve preparedness, and our final report culminated in a 300-page report with 6 in-depth regional basin studies which had experienced different extreme events that affected water services. We also tried to synthesize lessons learned, gaps, and future next steps. So these were our 6 case study sites across the region, and we selected them based on a geographic range, but also trying to get at different kinds of events that utilities are facing, and then different kinds of relationships they had with the research foundations and the larger national organizations. And this map is overlaid with a map by NOAA on the number of billion-dollar disasters, so disasters that have caused $1 billion or more in impacts since 1980. The darker red represents a higher number of disasters, and NOAA has seen that in the past, or since 1980, there's been a 5% per year increase nationwide in the number of billion-dollar disasters. So we conducted workshops in each of these 6 case study sites, really looking at what the risks are that utilities are facing and how they're adapting. And in order to do that, we had to first define what do we mean by an extreme event. So for our study, we use the definition that an extreme event is one that is highly unusual within local memory and that has significant consequences as defined by that community, remembering that events mean different things to different communities on the local scale. So this could be in terms of cost or impact. And depending on the area of the country, the time of year, and also other factors such as climate change, utilities were facing a range of risks from extreme events such as wildfires, hurricanes, atmospheric rivers, droughts, nor'easters, sea level rise, derecha windstorms, and even other ones. And the risks that come from these events are really tied to how climate change is altering the global water cycle. We're seeing changes in precipitation patterns, as was mentioned in the earlier presentations, and specifically in both the frequency of events and the severity of events. So this is really impacting our current and future water supplies, but also the way that we are managing water in cities. And extreme events have the potential to disrupt water, wastewater, and stormwater services, both temporarily and long-term, damaging critical infrastructure, but also access to that infrastructure that we rely on. They also leave a very costly aftermath. Remember the billion-dollar disaster map that you saw? This can be in terms of clearing out floodwaters of our treatment facilities, debris in the roads, repairing infrastructure, downed power lines, water main breaks, sanitary sewer overflows, and building new storage facilities. A lot of the infrastructure we rely on every day, but we don't actually see as we go about our day-to-day lives. And we see that too much or too little water has severe water quality impacts. It's important to note when we looked at case studies, environmental impacts aren't always measured during the actual event themselves, which makes sense because utilities are focused on getting services back online as quickly as possible, public health, public safety, and hardly anyone had specific data on environmental impacts, but everyone noted that they were there. Loss of tree cover, erosion, poor water quality, increased salinity of water, large sediment loads, and impact on aquatic life, which has a much longer-term impact on the communities and water services. And of course, all of this has an impact on our economy. California's current drought and the debate about agriculture is a recent example, but we've also seen this in the past with navigable waterways on the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. So in looking at how to manage these systems and these risks, we found that communities are thinking about rebuilding in different ways. And one framework we really liked was the Flexible Adaptation Pathways framework, which is developed by NASA. This framework suggests a continuous, dynamic consideration of risk tolerances and responses and policies that coordinate to that. So we see that doing nothing different, the blue line, or even adapting to climate change, but in one set way, results in a higher risk over time. But if we have a continual monitoring and reassessment with each event and in each community, this allows for flexibility and reduces risk over time. If we add in mitigation measures, our risk is lowered even further, the green line. And this is really important as the best available science changes over time. So by letting adaptation measures evolve with the science and with the events that we experience, rather than locking ourselves into one long-term strategy, this is what is helping utilities close the gap on the acceptable boundary of risk and how they manage it in our cities. So how does this actually play out on the ground? What did we see from our utilities and how are they building this kind of flexible adaptation to better manage risks? We had a geographic range of studies and we're interested to find what communities are doing, both by what they had in common, but also where they differed. I'm going to focus on the common examples today, but just a brief overview of the differences. A major finding was that, of course, every locality had a different experience, but not just within the city or river basin itself, but with each event that it experienced. So workshops highlighted the unique ways in which communities are working to meet those specific challenges. This reinforced that there's no silver bullet adaptation strategy, but that information sharing and innovation are paramount, though they might not always apply to every situation. But learning strategies from one another can help us better grapple with localized risk. And because experiences are at one point in time, true resiliency requires a particular attention to the local situation, strengths, and resources. And despite the uniqueness we saw in each of the 6 case studies, we also had several key findings emerge. So I'm going to go over our common themes and give you a brief snapshot of examples in our case studies, but again, please check them out for detail. They're all publicly available. Oops. Okay. So first, we see that risk management is greatly affected at utilities by 2 factors. First factor, the cascading nature of extreme events, meaning a multiple types and occurrences of events that are more frequent and more severe. A lot of utilities aren't just dealing with drought or flood, but cycles of these. And second, that the variety of extremes necessitates managing in an integrated planning for multiple risks. And an example of this in our Central Texas case study, where communities were faced with water shortages from a prolonged 3-year drought that also led to more severe wildfires, we really saw collaborative efforts between utility operators and firefighters. They worked side by side to repressurize pumps and repair meters that had melted during wildfires. Utilities helped the fire department use GPS to track locations in need of emergency response that had burnt down when their landmarks burnt down. And coordination between many groups helped protect the utility workers as they went in to repair the water system. Second, we see that in building resilience, we must consider the value of water services and infrastructure, one of our nation's most critical assets. So this is both looking at emergency preparedness and the ability to recover as a top priority, but also building long-term preparedness in terms of redefining infrastructure and addressing particular vulnerabilities. So here in the ACF Basin in Georgia, after the 2009 flood, we saw Douglas County cleared out the floodwaters and built plans to elevate critical assets. They refurbished their wastewater recovery facility, installing overhead structures, lifting pumps, and specifically relocating the control room to a higher level. Because without the control room, you can't do anything to restore operations during a flood. So these were long-term strategies that affected their short-term emergency preparedness. And third, we found that building resilience communities requires active involvement with the community. The community must understand their risk and define their risk tolerance, so building public awareness. And also community decision-making within a basin is really important. Water knows no boundaries, and we have to work across water service areas and jurisdictional boundaries. So we saw this in the Russian River Basin, where utilities during atmospheric river floods, droughts, and an unusual spring frost, 10 utilities came together for a regional water conservation plan, and then they also brought in grape growers and wine councils in order to construct water storage ponds to protect the vineyards during drought. And finally, all of our utilities said that creating actionable information, meaning information that is both accessible and can be used to a locality's advantage, is really important. And my favorite example of this was in the lower Missouri River Basin, where Overland Park and Johnson County developed stormwatch.com. This was a localized flood warning system, and the counties established an MOU with the National Weather Service and also worked with the Army Corps to collect data from weather stations in the area and create this real-time weather data to assess flood risk and really scaling down national climate information to the local level. So just to quickly finish up here, where do we go forward? What our utilities highlighted as the most important factors is to keep elevating the risks that the water sector faces and the importance of climate change adaptation. Continuing to work with communities to increase awareness and public support, and work across boundaries for collaborative efforts between communities and utilities, but also with federal agencies and research organizations. And then again, making information accessible, but also actually using it in our planning as we look at infrastructure. And to this end, WRF and its partners, including and led by NOAA, have been contributing to the water portion of the Climate Resiliency Toolkit, which is a free online tour that takes users through a 5-step strategy for climate planning. And it's customizable, but what I really want to point out on here is the newly released Water Resources Dashboard, which is really getting at that gap of making information accessible. It's kind of a one-stop shop for water utilities planning data needs. All of the data sets have a brief description, a link to the data set if it's outside, and examples of case studies where utilities are actually using that data set in their climate planning. So we will be co-hosting learning sessions, 20-minute learning sessions throughout the next year on different data sets within the climate dashboard with experts from NOAA and then also utility practitioners talking about how they can use it in their resiliency planning. So look forward to that. And I would like to just give a special thanks to all of my co-authors on this project. And I'll take your questions at the end of the panel. Thank you.
So my name is Derek Kanakis. I'm from the Voinovich School at Ohio University. Does this come up at all? Apparently not. I'll bend over a little bit more. Can people hear me okay? So I'm going to present work that's going to be co-presented with our recent graduate of ours, Jackie. I'm going to have her come up and present some of the data initially. This is work that's been done at a national scale, and we've sort of subset it down to look particularly at the Great Lakes water basin. So this is a national government study that we did with the National Science Foundation to look at what local governments were doing in terms of climate policy. We are going to look here on just the data from the Great Lakes watershed. I'll admit to everybody here, I'm new to the region. I was in Nevada as of last year, so our water issues are slightly different from yours. We're the ones talking about building a pipeline from the Great Lakes, by the way, just so you know. And we're going to look specifically in this case at who in the water sector, very broadly defined, is engaged in climate planning. We want to talk about what they're doing. We're going to give you a quick overview of the data, and you can ask any other questions later. We're looking at a 30,000-foot view, and then the sources of information, where organizational learning is actually occurring, so where you're getting information on innovation, and then what are your barriers to doing things better in the climate-water intersection. So I'm going to be an academic. I'm not going to apologize for it. Definitions matter a lot. So resiliency, again, is that central theme for this conference. We need to remember it's something different from adaptation. It's something different fundamentally from the idea of a coping strategy. So coping is that long term, that short term we deal with it and then get back to what we were doing before. Adaptation is we change things, but we do it sort of in a way that we think the future is somewhat predictable. Resilience is a different animal. It's kind of this idea that you're going to fundamentally be ready for surprises, that it's cross-sectoral, it's integrative, it's this concept that's frankly quite hard for local managers to deal with as a planning tool because you're planning for an uncertain future. So I have lots of sympathy with my local planning colleagues who say resiliency, oh my God. It's a lot of planning meetings, and it's hard to get the quantitative analytics you want to have as somebody engineering systems for big question marks in the near future. So I always say it's being ready for surprises. It's fundamentally being ready to reorganize, being nimble on your feet. That's a big challenge for a lot of local jurisdictions. So to reemphasize, locals where the action is. Our local governments have been the ones who've led in climate policy in the U.S. The first climate action plan, 1993, was the city of Portland. It's where we see the interesting stuff happening. It's where we've seen them fill the gap when the feds sit back and nothing happens. And as we've heard, as the states continue to have priorities elsewhere, we continue to see action at the local level. The nature of climate adaptation kind of demands local response. These are highly localized events and impacts. So even when we talk about droughts and flood events, as we've seen for some of the other data that's been presented here, these have impacts that are extremely localized. In the West, I used to say when we get a rain event, what happens on the west side of the mountain versus the east side of the mountain is fundamentally different. So it matters what your community is, it matters what your infrastructure is. These are very diverse responses that we need to this large-scale global impacts of climate. And then we're going to be comparing, the purpose of this study is just compare who's doing what where, who's sharing information. We are eventually going to look at where are those hubs of innovation at the national level, who's borrowing, what are the networks, who's talking to who. That's a lot of messy data. Whoops. So this is funded by the National Science Foundation as part of a climate infrastructure award. We identified organizations at the local government level that we thought would, in the broadest array of our imagination, might be impacted by climate change. We did a very broad survey. This is the first national survey that's been done. We even surveyed animal control departments thinking, maybe zoomorphic diseases somebody's looking at. We didn't get any responses from animal control departments. But it's very, very broad-based, very broad scope. We sent out 13,000 invitations to participate in the survey. We got back about 1,300 responses, I think 1,377. When we took out non-responses, it comes to about a 12-13% response rate. Not bad for a survey. And I would add to it, we had very interesting engagement by local governments. Usually when I send out climate surveys, I get little nasty political notes back. Got a few of those. In this case, I got comments on the end that said, this is really important. We need to know what the heck to do here. Please publish quickly. So there's a lot of enthusiasm from local actors to kind of understand what other local jurisdictions are doing. And this is our sample. It's a good distribution. We see about 13% across sectors. We didn't see any initial bias. Kind of we see the clusters where we expect them to be. Just so you know, the green are people who sent us a survey back. The red are people who we sent surveys out to. They did not respond to us. And then we also have all the overseas territories as well. So our methods, we're going to look at in this study, what we're going to talk about in the next 10 minutes is just water sector. We're going to talk about current activities, sources of information, organizational learning, and barriers gap in the Great Lakes Basin. So we sent out survey questionnaires to 704 organizations in the area. We got back responses from about 80, and of those, 20 identify that they're involved in water sector activities. So it's a fairly small sample, but we'll show you the distribution. And at this point, I will let Jackie take over, talk about some of the data. So the yellow dots are showing those who identify themselves as engaged in water management. And as you can see, this is a fairly urbanized sample. I think this is one of the biases we do have in the data is we got a lot from urban, a little bit less from some of the outlying areas, probably also reflecting higher capacity in urban areas. So Jackie, the floor is yours for a few.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Does this have a pointer on it, do you know? Okay, great. So Derek explained the distribution of our respondents, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the results. We chose some of these questions out of the entire survey to kind of tailor to this conference. So this question we had asked was, which of the following best describes your organization? Water managers and non-water managers, for the most part, were local government agencies, followed by state government agencies. We asked what their primary organizational role was. For water managers, it's public infrastructure, unsurprising, government administration, and other. And for non-water managers, government administration, public health, and other. Other included schools, utilities, public safety, environmental regulation, and land use planning. And then, what are other, for just water managers, what are other issues is your organization associated, aside from infrastructure? They said energy, recreation, and office of an elected official. And some of the natural resource areas are clustered towards the bottom, which is indicative of the urban nature of the watershed. Oops. There we go, sorry. We asked, what's the planning time frame of your organization? Both water and non-water managers said 2 to 5 years, which is slightly alarming, seeing as climate change is typically a long-term planning process. Also noted that one water manager did say that their organization is doing nothing. And so this is just involving just water managers. We asked, where are they getting their information on the impacts of climate change? For the water managers responded that they're often getting information from consultants, occasionally from in-house and university research, and never from federal agencies and newspapers. So then now who are you, from who are you learning about climate policy? Again, for water managers. They're occasionally from citizen groups, occasionally or rarely from professional associations, rarely and never from private consultants or NGOs. So then again, for just water managers, we asked them to rate their level of concern about climate impacts. They responded that they're not at all concerned about decrease in snowfall and seasonal water shortage, decreased recharge rates of groundwater, decreased surface water availability, and increased severity of wildfires. But they are concerned about frequency of heat waves, flood events, extreme storm events, and then somewhat concerned about impacts on the economy and vegetation communities. So from this, we kind of can surmise that they're more concerned about sporadic events rather than long-term water management challenges. We also should note that this survey was conducted before the Flint water crisis. And then we asked your sources of policy constraint that affect your ability to act locally. For water managers, it was state level, followed by federal level regulatory policies, budgetary is in green. For non-water managers, miscellaneous constraints, which they described as meddling, partisan politics, and mandates, followed by state level regulatory policies. So then again, for both water and non-water managers, what one thing would improve climate change decisions within your organization? Water managers said incorporating climate science into decision making. For non-water managers, it was leadership. And our last question for this was, what do water managers need to better manage the potential coming climate impacts? For the most part, they said information about local impacts, followed by impacts on a specific resource that they manage. and then the capacity to respond to new policies. And the capacity to respond on a local level is critical in order to adapt to climate change on the local level.
Thanks, Jackie. This is my attempt to ground it in real examples, but I just got carried away with a really cool visualization. So we actually categorized what they said they were doing in climate policy, both according to things that were fundamentally vulnerability assessment and just looking at risk, trying to see what they're acceptable to, adaptation measures, so what they think fundamentally they can do to deal with fairly predictable impacts, and then those that are fundamentally resiliency. So resiliency was categorized as those that were cross-sectoral, community level, explicitly were resiliency plans, and talked about uncertainty embedded in some of the climate science. And this is our visualization of some of the activities in the area. So we have lots of community level planning efforts. I'll show that at the top. That really do kind of cross-sector, cross both vulnerability assessments, adaptation, resiliency. We have built infrastructure looking at assessing vulnerability. We usually talk about this as the first stage, second stage, third stage in terms of climate planning. We do have some cross-sectoral aspects in terms of vegetation management. So looking at forest communities and vegetation communities to change water dynamics. And then we also categorize according to those activities that were implemented. This is important for the study because we want to know where people are putting money where their mouth is and those things that are planned. So things that end up on a planning document that may or may not ever get implemented. So conclusions. I would say there's a couple things that stand out as different from this region from what we've seen in other regions of the U.S. This is a common theme that we see, is that providing information on that localization of climate science is very important. We've heard that through a lot of the presentations. So either whether we term that downscaling or being able to engage effective knowledge at the local community level. I would suggest for those who are practitioners in the area that the next movement is to think about more regionalization as we think of water systems at a larger scale. So communities often have these jurisdictional mandates that the new wave of climate resiliency is going to be talking about how do we deal with those upstream impacts on our downstream communities. Climate challenges do reflect this human-intensive landscape. You're a very different landscape than we have in other places. I think that's critically important to understand. There's no silver bullet. There's no one-size-fits-all. There are probably value added to think more about broader landscape level management. That is particularly challenging in any political environment, especially in the United States hyper-federalized system. Our citizen organization stands out as actually very unique for their role here in the Great Lakes watershed as opposed to other areas. In most cases, universities were providing the vast majority of information on climate policies or consultants. Here it seems to be those folks sitting around the table who represent citizen groups seem to be providing information about what other jurisdictions are doing that maybe is cool and interesting that could be done here. And then water sector does need to be kind of localized to climate science better. That's one of their needs. Linked to specific management issues. So again, the task on their table that day, how do I incorporate science into that? And then capacity building in terms of responsiveness to new policies. And we'll do questions later, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Good morning. Great to see so many faces that I know here. My voice is a little hoarse because I was singing last Friday with Case Western Reserve Choral Group, and I still haven't recovered from that event. But hopefully it'll, as you talk more, it'll clear out a little bit. First off, I'm from Cleveland. Been here for a lot of years, grew up in the Ohio area, although I did spend about 8 years living in Dearborn, Michigan, so I feel like I have some Michigan genes in me for those of you from Michigan here today. Also, I live in North Collinwood, so I'm glad that my councilman is here today to hear this talk and to learn about the whole resiliency piece. Specifically, I'm going to talk about regenerative design, and I know, Carol, you brought it up in your presentation, and this is from a talk that I did here at CSU a couple of months ago for one of Wendy's classes, much longer, much more involved, but I got to thinking about if we're going to have this conversation, I think it's really important that we kind of come to some idea of what regenerative design really constitutes. I also am approaching it as an ecologist. Spent a lot of time in the water resources area, and so I really felt like I needed to spend some time on that if you've not really spent looking into the whole notion of what is regenerative design. I'm going to turn my timer. So in thinking about today, oops. Uh-oh. There we go. In thinking about today, I went back and looked at a lot of the literature, and I don't know if you spend time in this area. There are several groups that are really trying to focus on defining what is regenerative design. And so the Regenesis group is a group that I've been following for a while. There's several other groups that are looking at that. I know from the organization that I represent, Biohabitats, it's an area that we spend a lot of time with. And of course, in a fundamental notion, regenerate means to recreate, but recreate what? Particularly when you're talking about ecosystems, they have changed dramatically and they're constantly evolving. And so there was a notion for a while we had to recreate almost what was in the past. But because of, particularly in urban systems, we have so many drivers going on in those systems, particularly when you think about stormwater, all the heat islands, the influences. What we're really talking about regenerative design is creating conditions that take into account all of the stressors that occur in that system, and believe me, there are a lot, such that we can regenerate life in those systems. Now, that's a lot different than the topic of ecological restoration, where I think in its purest form, what we're talking about is in a place or a setting where there are less influences. We want to recreate what was there, and we tend to have all of the large-scale connectivity that will allow that system to regenerate and then also evolve. But it is a real challenge, and I think it's a lot harder than many folks think in terms of how we're going to get there over time. So this is, for those of you who may know this paper, this comes from a paper by Reed in 2006, who took a look at the notion of where does regenerative design, moving from sustainability to regenerative, fit in, and then I hope to then make the connection to how regenerative fits in with the topic of today. So specifically, if you look across the top, and it's a little small, we talk about conventional design, moving through green design, sustainable design. And if you put that into dollars, probably those three combined represent, if you look at McGraw-Hill, probably about 95% of where the money is currently spent. As you get into starting into restorative design or regenerative design, there's not a lot there. And then what are the components that differentiate regenerative design? Well, number one, it really is about human systems and how we integrate them into ecosystems. And not just from a form, but from a functions or processes perspective. So if you look at the two arrows, if you're on the left side, conventional design, usually more energy required, and as you go up the scale in design, less energy. As you look at the conventional, they're very monoculture systems, but if you move over to regenerative design, then you're creating more stability over time, less energy in the system. And I think if we're going to think about this whole notion of resiliency in cities, particularly it relates to water, I think regenerative design is a key component of that whole topic that we're going to explore. So from the standpoint of regenerative, ecologically based design, it really is an approach that's holistic planning and design, where human activities are deeply integrated with living systems, and that's a key, continuously building biological diversity, living infrastructure, and I'll come back to that, resilience and community spirit. And the focus is on processes. So this is a little bit unusual because a lot of times we think about, when we do our buildings, a lot of structure, some processes, but it's the key, and we do it through what we call living infrastructure. And so the definition here is really important, which is strategically planned and managed network of natural lands, working landscapes, and other green spaces. And the key is working landscapes at many scales that conserve ecosystem functions, restore ecosystem processes, and regenerate healthy, robust, and water-resilient communities. From my experience, particularly in our area, because if you think it from a watershed perspective, we're really focused on trying to slow store water, trying to deal with the pollutants that are there, manage that water in such a way that it goes into the ground. And ultimately, of course, we have the health benefits as a part of this, the length of life. And so if you think about how this design integrates to the role of our human systems and urban systems, regenerative design is, I think, going to play a very key important of the solution. And what I'm going to do, the rest of the talk is going to be pictures, no more graphs or anything else. And I want to just take you through different ideas as looking through this lens of regenerative design. Now, most of you who are doing stormwater work already know what these are, bioretentions or rain gardens. And when you think about it, they really are a kind of a mini regenerative system because of what we do when we're building in the plant material, creating the biological activity in the soils, trapping the pollutants. And these are actually pretty small scale systems, but they do represent a form of regenerative design in my experience. To bring you closer to home, these are some examples of what's going on around here that I think you can characterize as a form of regenerative design to differentiate it from traditional ecological restoration. This happens to be a picture of the work that Cleveland Metro Parks has done in Scranton Peninsula, which is an extraordinary project that's been completed with a trail next to the Cuyahoga River. The Cuyahoga River, though, is a working river. You're never going to have the same kind of dynamics that you would have if that system were not boxed in like it is. So the idea is how do you address the problems of bow thrusters and all the things that go on that are unique to that ecosystem? Well, this is an example showing where a design was created which is going to be allowed, conducive for life, and eventually over time, and even the lower picture, which was early in that process, you see some holes there, but I think you'll see over time that that will probably create the conditions necessary to reestablish that. And of course, those of you who locally know the Cuyahoga River is pretty much hardened all the way through there, and there's just not a lot of biological structure or function going on in that area. But in terms of one project that I think is dealing with both the notion of how can we redesign these in such a way that we can create refugia, in this case for fish larvae, because there's no food sources. And so a project that was done by Cuyahoga County using a biomimetic approach. This is a pilot study, looked at how can we create structures that allow these processes or functions. I am pleased to say they survived the winter. One of the concerns, of course, was ice, but they're designed so that when the water's low, the ice is below the basket. So this is going to continue to be monitored by the sewer district, but I think is an example. Here's a case of a project in Virginia. We would call it traditionally daylighting. You can see the tennis court way in the background there, but this is an example where you probably can't restore to the full riparian system that you want, but suddenly you are now creating this biological system in the middle of campus. I suspect they had it wasn't a pipe, obviously, a pipe that probably was undersized, and now you've really transformed this to provide ecosystem services processes. One of the big challenges we have, of course, is streams in our urban environments. The old process was to go in and level the banks to reconnect the floodplains that way. One of the ideas that's emerged, mostly out of the Chesapeake Bay area, is bring up the channel so you don't have to go in and carve. And what we're finding is that brings the water table up, and this is in an urban environment, rehydrates the floodplain and creates all kinds of new processes that frankly were disturbed or no longer there. And we call that a RSC stream design. This is another example of a former dredge site in Maryland where you had saltwater intrusion. It was completely buried. And you can see the dikes that are sort of little berms that go across there. And to the right, this was done by Underwood Associates out of Maryland, who's doing some very innovative work in regenerative design arena. Obviously, it looks a little bit like ecosystem restoration, but when you begin to think about what was put into this, there are sort of unnatural systems there that are designed to present saltwater intrusion, water filtration, and also slow the water down that you can get conditions, again, conducive for life. Project right here that was done in Cleveland, up in 9 Mile Creek, has an RSC or regenerative approach to it. This was a detention basin, trapezoidal ditch, water was through, it was a dry detention basin. The city wanted to increase the capacity and proposed the idea of coming in and let's make this a lot more biologically active. And the idea was we came back in, put in a series of berm systems that allows the water to filter in, bacteria to start to generate, get better carbon capture, and this is what it looks like today. And you have to agree that that's a very different, almost living infrastructure as opposed to what was done before. This is a common problem we see in cities, in environments where we're trying to manage water. In this case, your outfall, you have too much water coming out there. Obviously, this is an extreme case simply because the soils are pretty erosive, but this is what we call, again, RSC design or stormwater, or regenerative stormwater conveyance, where you create a series of pools to slow the water down. You create the infrastructure pore space within that provides, and there's some really interesting work coming out of North Carolina on this to show how it's benefiting. And that's what the site looks like within about 3 years after it was created. It will continue to backfill in with vegetation because you don't plant the vegetation, you let the system adapt to what's going on in that particular location. Here's some, whoops, back up, common examples. This is in Baltimore, pretty typical, I think. This is a landscape where rooftop drains were taken. I think you're seeing a lot of this in terms of stormwater management. This is a really innovative project looking at an old pier. The idea is, can we convert this pier to create both active water purification benefit from solar energy, some other features in the area, and also play around with the idea. And some of this stuff tends to be pilot, kind of experimental. This actually is going forward. It's called Gray's Pier in Baltimore Harbor. Here's, again, these tend to be more micro scale as opposed to broad scale. I think to mention that just briefly, I think broad scale, we think of places like Cleveland Metro Parks, where they create that spine of the system and then work back into the communities. But as you work with that system, you know that it's degraded, but you have to start with sort of these micro scales. This is in Philly. If you look on the upper left-hand corner, you'll see this is partly restored, but it was a parking lot being restored. And here you see them cutting into the parking lot to create this dendritic garden. The idea is to both have water flow through it and also pour the water to sink in from the parking lot, but also then this is what it looks like today in terms of creating an active landscape that's providing pollinator flowers for pollination and also really helping connect to people and people connect to nature and Schuylkill River. To close out, I want to just talk briefly about integrated water strategies. I think this, again, is going to be in a critical area. This happens to be the Sidwell Friends School in Washington. It's where Obama sends his 2 daughters go here, or I think at least one of them did. It includes both stormwater as well as wastewater treatment, gray water use. It treats about 3,000 gallons a day. It was done by Underwood Associates again, and we were a partner with that in terms of the design of this site. But it's a kind of example of a small-scale system going off the grid, but at the same time being used to create biological activity in terms of carbon sequestration, filtration, and also a space where folks go. I don't have it here, but the picture. The last one I want to end up is this Haslow and 8th, which is a recent project that was completed in the Eco District, the Lloyd's Eco District Super Block project in Portland, Oregon. I don't know how many of you've seen this. It just was recently finished, but it's a project where infill housing generated about 1,500 housing units. That's the building. It's actually completed and done. It's a complete off-the-grid, pretty much a grid off the system for stormwater, has cistern, wastewater treatment on site in this. As a part of the project, about 45,000 gallons a day. It treats. This is a little, just to give you the profile, sort of how the site was designed. A firm, I want to make sure I give credit to the firm that did the overall architectural work on it, is GBD, was the architect for this project. We were the designer of the wastewater system and the stormwater system. And so you have rainwater, the complete system. This is what it looks like. Those large tanks are the trickling filters. We used the idea of wetlands, treatment wetlands in sequence, denitrification. At the end of the day, this meets the Class 1 City of Portland water quality standard for the site. Got about 30% energy reduction overall, 50% water reduction, and 100% wastewater production. It does have an emergency connection to the sewer system, but it's part of this idea with the whole idea as part of the whole notion of regenerative design. So that's a real quick run through. We could spend a long time on this subject, but I think as we look forward to thinking about water resilient cities, one of the key things is how do we link our cities back to the ecosystem processes that provide many benefits to us. And I think in terms of the conference, I'll be interested to see how we weave this back into the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
see how sensitive this is. Are we still morning? Good morning. I'm Brian Stubbs, Executive Director of a nonprofit here in Cleveland called the Cleveland Water Alliance. Hey. We're a water innovation cluster, and what that is a water and technology-based economic development organization, not to be confused with traditional-based economic development, which is a large focus of our work is about leveraging and changing current economic development to be thinking through the topic of this discussion, the topic of this conference theme. The world's changing, the climate's changing, population's growing. What does that mean in terms of Great Lakes regional economy? What does that mean for cities? What does that mean for advanced manufacturing? We're a unique setup, and this is something we really stress to other cities that we talk to about how to make a cluster-related event like ours work is who's at the table. You know, for us, it starts with, of course, our academic institutions and our research institutions, Cleveland State, Kent State, Case Western, Akron, NASA Glenn Research Center, Great Lakes Biomimicry. These are all research assets for our region that have come together from that perspective to bring value to the table. In that same breath, infrastructure has to be at the table. In our case, Avon Lake Regional Water, Cleveland Water, Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, Cleveland Metro Parks, they're all equally at the table. And then business and industry has to be at the table. For us, that's everything from large companies, from ArcelorMittal, the big steel mill up to Cuyahoga, to companies like Fairmont Central, Eaton, one of our sponsors here today, down to small upstart technology and water-based technology companies are at the table. So it starts there, but ultimately, what we're solving for, and I always describe this as think of it, and it might be appropriate for today, as an umbrella metaphor. At the very tip is how do we elevate the value of water in a changing world? And then the stems of that umbrella being how we go about doing that. So to give you an idea of some of those stems, some of the programming, you know, first of all, this idea of how do you accelerate innovation? You know, there was some talk about that at the morning session that we need to do that. Well, people are now starting to do that. For us, it's a variety of things. First and foremost, what are our problems here in Ohio? And what can we do from our Ohio talent, our research, our educational institutions to help solve for them? If innovation comes out of that and the innovation can be exported out, wonderful, home run. But first and foremost, how are we solving our problems here today? Two, collaborative research. Now to go one step back. The technologies within that water innovation cluster and what we're trying to solve for is everything. From technology developed from the mission to Mars for water reuse around plasma that we're trying to pull out of NASA and into the market. A lot of other water reuse technologies, distributed water systems, sorbents, a lot of work around industrial water treatment, et cetera. Collaborative research. We have some of the finest research institutions out there. And the fact that we can bring them together and start talking about how do we articulate and change the conversation. So to that, we launched last year a program and a research project called The Value of Water for Northeast Ohio. Very clever name. But we started looking at, you know, the economic, environmental, and societal values of clean water for this region. We started looking at direct, indirect, and induced values to come out of that. So the first phase we finished up late last year. Recently we received a foundation through the Coca-Cola Foundation, or a gift from the Coca-Cola Foundation, to launch phase 2, which we'll be launching at some point later this year, to really be able to articulate this broad conversation that's going on here. We have to talk about it more, and we have to talk about it in ways that makes sense to our policymakers, to our elected officials, to our businesses, showing them the opportunity, but most importantly to the citizens. We're living in a world now of unfunded mandates around water infrastructure. That's going to require a lot of money to be spent, money correctly. We have to be able to articulate that connection between jobs, job retention, job creation, to water, clean water, the value of water and water infrastructure. Out of that work came this third bucket that you see up there, which is this idea of water-enabled business and industry strategy. Water-enabled industrial work is something where we're now looking and talking to companies about this idea of climate resiliency. Where is your capital infrastructure? How much water do you use? Should you be in the Central Valley of California? Is that important to your logistical supply chain versus an area that's not going to have water stresses? And then one other program that follows up perfectly with what Tom was mentioning, and then reinforcing the conversation from this morning, we have to start doing things and doing projects that we can show to people. So to that, we have a partnership now, a P3, public-private partnership with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Office of Coastal Management. This is also a program through the University of Akron's Biomimicry Innovation Institute, GL Bio. A couple of our other partners are also working in different ways, like Avon Lake Regional Water, Ross Environment. But the idea here, and there may be an unnamed and yet to be named company because we haven't publicly announced it, that spoke after me, that's also part of one of these programs, but it's a PhD fellow using biomimicry, bioeconomic research to start solving problems. So for us, our first project is taking a look at biomimicry-inspired solutions to improve water quality associated with stormwater runoff, point source discharge, and urban shoreline stabilization. ODNR has this vision, the Office of Coastal Management, of really taking a look at the entire coastal area of Lake Erie and Ohio and having a policy and having a vision on what that looks like in a positive, ecologically beneficial way over this next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Of course, one of the challenges here is we talk 5, 10, 15, 20 years. A lot of my businesses are talking the next quarter, so there's always that little kind of friction there. By the way, we are and will be releasing next week our job description for our first PhD candidate that we'll be recruiting to start next year. So please feel free to check our website and or email me, and we'd be glad to get that out there. I think we're not going to be any shortage of having candidates, but just in case. So to note, and again to follow up on this morning's conversation, this stuff's starting to take hold on the role of innovation, water investments, water infrastructure, how it can move an economy, how it retains jobs, how it creates jobs. So we were recognized by the White House for 2 of our programs a few weeks ago. One is the Biomimic PhD Fellowship Program to work on water resiliency. But 2, the value of water research. Nobody's has gone this broad in terms of economic development and put it on the ground that we have. So we hope we're barking up the right tree on that. So, you know, one of the things that we've been thinking through the value of water and this impact into water-based industrial attraction is, one, what are the drivers? You know, the value of water, end value, is obviously increasing, and there's a lot of different inputs on that. I'm not talking price, I'm talking broader range of values. Then I am talking in terms of pricing. Water rates outstripping inflation by 18%. Why is that important? Well, that is important because water has been so heavily subsidized as an infrastructure piece. Those days are over. As I mentioned earlier, this idea or concept of unfunded mandates. We right now here in Cleveland and Northeast Ohio are going through a $3 billion CSO separation that was a consent decree. We have to do it, we want to do it, but it's unfunded. For the first time, you're going to start seeing rates start to speak to allowing for equity investing and private placement of dollars to come in to help accelerate water innovation. Before that, the ROIs just weren't there. This is a very big paradigm shift. And of course, aging infrastructure, regulations increasing, climate change, and a sudden appetite for people to look at P3s. You know, something water infrastructure agencies traditionally hate is this idea of risk. So how can we have programs that help them take on more risk so they don't have to take that risk, but we can find private dollars to help with that risk and to innovate. And of course, you know, these last few points are not going to, and shouldn't be new to most in this room, but then we start looking at this from a macro standpoint and how it relates to the Great Lakes region. You know, half the world's population moving towards being in water-stressed areas. 22% of the world's GDP right now is produced in water-scarce areas. And then that came up with this map. And this is kind of the starting point for us. And as I've been trying to influence the economic development system in Ohio, when you start looking at where water stresses are going to be with unchecked population growth, and you start to tell the story or a perfect bad map in terms of, first of all, some of those communities that are expecting to grow aren't going to be able to meet their water needs. Two, there is going to be a role, correctly so, of innovation, water reuse technologies, but they're going to be expensive and probably too expensive for some of our industrial users. And then I look down there at poor Florida, and bluntly, they're going to be given land back. Some colleagues of mine did a piece on this, and it's called "How Do We Retreat Gracefully?" How do we properly give up land because the oceans are rising? So with that, we went into this weird area that a lot of, I wish more of us could get into, which is the economic development system. Bringing the people that work with companies on retaining jobs, understanding their stresses, and talking to companies about, if you're relocating, what are your infrastructure needs moving forward? And out of that, we started creating an actual platform and what's called a socialization tool on informing, getting people to start talking about this, to start talking with businesses about it. And I say this as I was doing our research on this. I sat down with the division of Sherwin-Williams and the people who handle all their site selection. This conversation about water stresses was a deer in the headlight moment with them. They hadn't even thought about it. But do you not think that the C-level suite, boardroom aren't starting to think about this? They are, but there's a communication lag there. What do we need to do to bring that and change that and close that gap? I'm not going to bore you with this one. This is a traditional economic development map of kind of how it's approached. How companies approach it, how states approach it, how economic development agencies approach it. And the issue here is climate change, resiliency, water stresses has never been part of this. So we're now changing this to have water, which was a little line item on, maybe 17 on their to-do list and doing their due diligence, and it was more about a price than anything else. How do we get that engaged to be a much higher, which is starting to happen with some of our companies like Nestle Waters, it's suddenly in the top one. So, coming out of this is this idea of this conversation of financial risk and reputational risk. And I'll bring up Nestle Water again as a good example of that. They're taking a reputational hit right now because they're drawing on aquifers, which they have the legal right to do in California and Florida. Most people in this room know what those aquifers look like right now. They're draining and they're not going to be replenished. One El Nino, we need about 5 of this year's back to back just to start to make a dent in that. They are taking a stock price hit because of that. What we're also seeing and talking to our more water-enabled industry contacts is the cost of borrowing for infrastructure is starting to go up. The cost of private equity dollars are starting to go up. We're now starting to see risk associated with water stresses for the first time. Oops. So just give you an idea, for $1 of output of a paint company, they use 123 gallons of water in manufacturing. Paperboard's 36 gallons, cheese, 8.8 gallons. Brewery. Anybody know the brewing ratio of water in versus water out into a product? 8-1. Oddly, Coca-Cola, 1.8-1. It's interesting on the companies that have taken pressure, and correctly so, to do better, are really making some advances because of water technology and a different way of thinking. Thank you, Wendy. So as we started talking to companies and started socializing this idea of, is there a there there? Everybody's been talking water, the new oil. Great Lakes is well situated. There has to be a complete focus on water quality, first and foremost, but within that context, what does it mean? So, the things that we're looking at now are proximity, capacity, quality and use, reliability. Can't stress reliability enough, and sustainability as being this complete metric. And then we look at a place like Northeast Ohio, which central basin of Lake Erie, healthy system, still has work to be done, and we're still advocating and even, I'm not going to use the word lobbying, we're a 501c3, but advocating strongly that more dollars get put into the protection of all 3 basins of the Lake Erie. But the idea here is, water capacity. Cleveland and the water system here was built for about 250% more people than we have today. It's built, it's resilient, it's been kept up, And it's even being advanced by some of our water partners with new ideas, new ways of thinking. So it's fascinating that we can handle a lot more water users. That's going to make Cleveland a little more competitive than some of our other regional partners, just because we've done it. We can take a whole water pumping station offline. You're not going to feel an ounce of pressure drop. We have multiple water intakes, and we're promoting this idea of one water, as mentioned earlier. We're strong members of the U.S. Water Alliance of distributed systems, but also then resilient and redundant systems that one water department can and should be working with another.
Oops.
Well, given time, here's the big takeaway for us when we're talking about with the economic development focus. Everybody still wanted to talk water. Our elected officials right here around us, I'm not going to mention names, but throughout the state, they're like, well, get me information about water. We don't care about water pricing. This is not a water pricing. This is a water quality and water reliability issue. So that's what we're trying to stress is the Great Lakes, if done and handled correctly, is going to drive innovation. We have this cluster. We have these companies, these wonderful new technologies that are going to help us do better. That is going to be more of a one water, one loop system, and you're never going to take the water out of the Great Lakes watershed. So with that, thank you, Wendy.
Okay, let's hope for the best here. I haven't had training on this nifty device. Was that? I hope so. Okay, so hi everyone. I am faculty here at the College of Urban Affairs, and I spend my time sitting in my office and thinking deep thoughts. And then every now and then I emerge and listen to you, and I'm amazed at how pretty close everybody is to the emerging thinking, and mine doesn't diverge either. So although most of the speakers before me, that's the bane of the last speaker, most of the speakers before me have sort of stolen my thunder, it's still pretty good, I hope, but you'll be here to tell me. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about a different way of making decisions. But to you, it's not that different because you've been talking about this all morning. And I call it unplanned. We're supposed to coin terms and jargon, so I call it unplanned. And I want to also touch on the use of scenarios in this unplanning approach because they're pretty central to what I'm trying to describe. So let's see. Oh, yeah. No? No. Okay. Oh, I need help. Which one? This one?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm already humiliated. Everybody seemed to fall right in, and I'm just having trouble with it. Yeah. I didn't think that was my first. So yes, that works. Okay. It looks different from here. Okay, so I'm breaking news to no one with this slide. Our region is buffeted by some serious threats, and some are immediate, and some are middle and long term, and we lack the capacity to address them all. We don't have the resources to deal with everything, even in the best of worlds, which ours isn't. So what should we do? What should we do first? And what happens if we don't do it all? And so the immediate thought is we need to prioritize, right? We need to prioritize collectively as communities, and you've heard about collective action all morning, so I totally agree with it. So, no. I'm a slow learner, definitely. Oh, okay, got it, I think. Yes. So I'm skipping the usual resilience introduction. You've done it for me this morning. And I'll sort of cut to my message, which is context matters. So even if we agreed on all the priorities and had the resources that we would need to attend to them, and we've heard some solutions here that sound amazing, but they are probably very costly too right now. They'll maybe drop in price as we do more and more of them, but right now we need a lot of resources. We'd still face complexity and uncertainty and rapid change and social differences that make it difficult to get on the same page with what we'd like to see happen in terms of community resilience. But I want to remind everybody something that, again, you know, which is that not making a decision is a decision too. Failure to decide is a decision too. And the environmental area, this has dramatic effects. And we may not be able to afford not to do anything. It may have the costliest consequences. So how do we pull it off in the context of urban and metropolitan spaces like ours, which we call legacy areas, with social and ecological diversity and deep problems and challenges, so that we make sure that we enhance our water resources for the future? So, hey, it worked. The next thought that I want to remind you of is that cookie cutter, generic, even best practices solutions do not really work for specific places. In other words, we have to tailor to our place. And to collaborate, which we all seem to agree that that's necessary in our regions, to collaborate, people need to feel that they can have an impact on outcomes, not that they just come and say, yes, you're right, let's do it, and that their choices are intertwined. And we can't, therefore, operate at very large scales with these collaboratives. So I'm making a pitch for projects that happen at the local scales, examples of which we've seen already. In other words, I'm going to conclude that we should think smaller than maybe we like to think. And so, for example, although many of us would like to go back in time, we can go to the pristine past, and we can't roll back the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. And so what we choose to do collectively matters enormously. And in particular, the kind of resilience that we mean to implement matters. And I'm going to come back to this. So we all know that there is going back, bouncing back, and adapting and transforming. That's a decision that we can make. It's not a decision that actually just happens. We can choose what we want to do, and my example will have to do with this. So another challenge that we're facing is that acute uncertainty that is contributed to a great extent by climate change, which is new to us. And so even with the greatest of imaginations, we may not be able to actually picture what all will happen at the end of the century. But we heard already that we're already feeling some impacts, so we can attend to those. So all this means that picking a target year far in the future, like 25, 30, 50 years, and then crafting the means to actually hit that target is sort of a fool's errand. We like to do that a lot, and in my planning profession, especially, we like to set that target and say, let's go to it. But by the time we reach it, much of everything will have changed, including our needs and our technologies and how we do things and what we prefer. And to see this, you just have to think about 20 years before, when we couldn't have imagined that my little cell phone has more memory than the computer had at Carnegie Mellon when I did my PhD, which was a whole building, right? So we can't even imagine what's going to be in 30 years, although we might think we can. We can't. So having that image and trying to hit it is not the greatest way to plan, I think. So visions obsolesce quickly. So the further our target is, the truer what I'm saying is, I think. I'm proposing this to you. You can disagree. So, yeah. So currently, everybody you talk to thinks they know about resilience and want it and think of it positively. Though I want to propose to you that sliding back to what used to be is a very resilient system, but we may not want to do that, right? So we've been talking today mostly about adapting, and people haven't talked too much about transforming, but we should do it. And so whatever the choice we make, we have to have it be implementable. If plans that are on the paper have never done any good to anybody. I'm proposing to unplan. Did it do that? Yes. So this is my suggestion, and Wendy tells me I only have 3 minutes, so I'm not sure that I can go into all the details. But the switch that I'm proposing is from plans to if-then strategies because big plans are not implementable. We want to switch from long horizons to short to midterm horizons for our decisions. And what I think Beth said this morning, where she said we're in this sweet range where we can still make decisions, and after that, reality sort of goes into various directions. I don't know if you remember that graphic. I love this, except I want to propose to you that we're always in that sweet range. If we do adaptive steps that are small and incremental, we'll always find ourselves in that spot because we can adapt. As we take one path, we still have a lot of choices and we proceed in small steps. So basically, I'm proposing small incremental steps. And instead of predicting a fixed future, predictions are nothing to write home about the longer the horizon is. I propose plumbing the range of futures, producing scenarios of what could be, and then making robust decisions. A robust decision is one that works for the broadest range of futures we can imagine. And we'll still be wrong, and there'll still be black swans, but we'll be surprised far less often by what the future holds, I think, in this way. And then the last proposal is that we should switch from expert-driven plans to collaborative initiatives, and I understand that a lot of people are sold on it already, so I don't need to go into it too much. Okay, so I jumped, but that's okay. I guess. Oh, I think I should have had more practice on this. All right. So the next pitch is for collaborative, and I probably can actually skip it because I seem to have agreement in this room that we need to engage in collaborative thinking. But the collaborative part requires a lot of attention to communication, and some of the speakers address this need to communicate better with all the stakeholders involved. Not talk at them, not give them information, not educate them, but actually collaborate, actually talk to each other. Okay, so here was an example of what Wendy Kellogg and I worked on regarding one of the watersheds in the region, and they are important to the Great Lakes, of course, so I'm not going to make that pitch either. And so how do we foster resilience in watersheds in the face of climate change? I propose that we should act now. And acting now means that we're not going to lift the world from a corner in Ohio. I'm suggesting to us all that we attend to all the problems that we see now in watersheds and make our usual goals about climate change and about the future, make them criteria instead. So don't shoot to fix climate change. We won't manage from Ohio tomorrow. But we still have problems tomorrow, and we should make climate change a criterion. As we pick among solutions that we're looking at, we should pick those that are friendliest to what we think climate change would bring to us, and we should pick the ones that do not reduce the space for the future. We don't know what's going to be. And so instead of shooting for that fixed future, let's try to not reduce options for people who are not yet born even. So that means not making irreversible changes to the environment, whether it's the natural or the built, and trying, well, we can make irreversible to the built, but certainly not to the natural environment. And so let's pick the solutions that do that trick where it's slowly adaptive and still leaves open most possibilities for the future. So the tools for doing this, but Wendy's not going to let me talk about it too much, are scenarios. And this is a snapshot of how I see collaborative exchanges of information regarding a watershed or regarding any water problem or any problem in the urban space. And you see that in the middle there in bright yellow sit the what-if scenarios. And they can be generated at the confluence of several kinds of knowledge. All these kinds of knowledge should participate in our constructing scenarios. So we shouldn't take just science, we shouldn't take just the water professionals, we should incorporate all the knowledge that we can possibly do. So here was the example. So here we were looking at predicting some hydrology regimes for the watershed given climate change predictions, given what we expect from climate change. So on the bottom you see degrees of acting to remediate, to adapt, to do good things to the watershed. And then vertically you see the hydrological regimes. And these are possibilities. This is the scenario part. This is what tells us what might happen to the watershed. And so you see several regions with some brown strips in between. The first region is one where we do nothing. And we should be so lucky that without doing anything, we're going to basically have the best of worlds. So that's very unlikely, so we probably should not pay too much attention to that region. Then we have a hopeless region where we'll be surprised, and whatever we do, even very proactively, will still net some very bad outcomes. And so we might not be able to totally mitigate that kind of situation. Where we have a range of decisions that I think is interesting is where I labeled it trade-off scenarios. And they straddle. The middle strip is adaptive moves, and the extreme right strip is transformative moves, right? So adapting means responding to the challenges that we see and making the best of what's hitting us. Transforming is actually taking serious action and going into different regimes. And that is costly and difficult to implement. So they both have pros and cons, these adaptive and transformative moves. The region where we have trade-offs is that we can see how these regions overlap. The brown is an overlap among the regions, and so there might be a possibility to do adaptive moves for the watershed and still be okay. And there's also the possibility within these scenarios of absolutely having to transform in order to cope. Bottom line, this is a kind of scenario tool that can help us make wise and planning decisions. And so since Wendy's going to kick me out pretty soon, I'm going to conclude and say this is basically what we should look at and how we should approach planning. Short-range adaptive moves, convert long-term goals to criteria for our current moves, make robust implementable decisions with a short horizon, because we just don't know for the long, and we risk making huge investments in something that we'll never know if it worked or that might fail because the future that we imagined just didn't happen. And pilot test and make small changes that allow you to backtrack and fix if it didn't work. So all this think small, make small changes has a lot of benefits. Not in all cases, nothing works in all cases, but I propose that we basically scale back on our ambitions and make the best of now. And people will go along with things that they can benefit from now rather than expecting in the year 2100 that it's going to be a good world when they won't be there to check it out. And we need to work at collaborative scales. Thank you. Yes, I'm set.